This video is on energy transfer through food chains and food webs. So by the end of this video, we will have found out that in an ecosystem, plants synthesize organic compounds from atmospheric or aquatic carbon dioxide that's come from the air or from water, and that most of the sugars synthesized by plants are used by the plant itself as a respiratory substrate, and then the rest are used to make other groups of biological molecules, such as lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and that these biological molecules form the biomass of the plants. We'll learn that gross primary production, or GPP, is the chemical energy store in plant biomass in a given area or volume, and that net primary production is the chemical energy store in plant biomass after respiratory losses to the environment have been taken into account. So we'll look at the relationship between these factors. So NPP, or net primary productivity, is gross primary productivity minus respiration losses. Net primary production is available for plant growth and reproduction. It's also available to other trophic levels or other feeding levels in the ecosystem, such as herbivores and decomposers. And the net production of consumers, which is sometimes called secondary productivity, can be calculated as N equals I minus F plus R. So I represents the chemical energy store in ingested food. So net productivity is ingested food minus losses due to chemical energy loss to the environment in feces and urine, and R represents the respiratory losses to the environment. And then primary and secondary productivity is the rate of primary or secondary production, respectively. So primary in plants and secondary in consumers. It's measured as biomass in a given area, and biomass, by the way, is dry mass in a given area in a given time. So for example, you might see these units, which is kilojoules, so kJ is kilojoules, HJ minus 1 means per hectare, which is per area, unit area, per year. Okay, so that is actually measured as a rate. On this slide, we can see a green plant here, which is a producer. We've got the definition over here of a producer. So producers are able to fix carbon. In other words, carbon which is in an inorganic form, in the form of carbon dioxide, can be fixed into organic molecules such as glucose by the process of photosynthesis. So producers photosynthesize. They're autotrophic, which means they can make their own organic molecules such as glucose from inorganic substances like carbon dioxide and water, and they convert light energy to chemical energy. So light energy is used for photosynthesis, and that light energy is then used to produce glucose. So the glucose contains the chemical potential energy. The light energy has been converted, and they can also convert inorganic carbon dioxide into organic molecules. So the carbon dioxide, like I say, becomes part of an organic molecule in the form of glucose. So we've got our producer here, which is or autotrophic organism, which is always the first organism in a food chain or a food web, because what we're looking at here is we're looking at energy flow through an ecosystem, and obviously the source of that energy, or the source of a very vast majority of that energy, is sunlight. So we've got some terms here to relate to our producers. We've got here the gross primary production and the net primary production. So gross primary production, the definition here says the chemical energy store in plant biomass in a given area or volume. So we can think about it as being the total amount of light energy that is converted into chemical potential energy by the plant. So it's effectively the total amount of glucose that the plant makes by photosynthesis. The net primary production, or net primary productivity, then is the chemical energy store in plant biomass after respiratory losses to the environment have been taken into account. So what we mean by this is that of all the glucose that the plant produces, it's not all stored in the plant as biomass, because the plant has to use some of that glucose itself for respiration, for its own energy needs. So once the amount of glucose that's been used for respiration has been taken off the GPP, the gross primary productivity, that gives us the net primary productivity. Okay, we've also got down here the equation. It's showing the relationship between photosynthesis and respiration. Effectively, in the most simple terms, they are the opposite of each other, aren't they? So by photosynthesis, we get carbon dioxide and water, inorganic substances being converted to glucose and oxygen. We need light energy for that, and obviously chlorophyll to absorb that light energy. And the organic molecule of glucose contains that carbon, that inorganic carbon, now in an organic molecule. And then respiration is effectively the opposite, isn't it? It's breaking down the glucose in order to release that chemical potential energy again. And because it's not 100% efficient, this process, some of that energy is lost as heat to the environment. In this slide, we're having a look at how efficient the plants are at transferring the energy from the sun into chemical potential energy in the form of glucose, that gross primary productivity. But as it says here, they're not 100% efficient. Not all the energy from sunlight that reaches a leaf is used in photosynthesis. So some is reflected from the surface of the leaf, some is not absorbed, so some might be transmitted through the leaves, and that might be because it misses chloroplasts, or even if it hits a chloroplast, it might miss the chlorophyll within the chloroplasts. Some of the light is the wrong wavelength. So for example, green light can't be absorbed by photosynthetic pigments. It's reflected, or it's the wrong wavelength to be absorbed. And the fact that photosynthesis is not 100% efficient. So even though light might be of the right wavelength and it might hit a chloroplast and hit the chlorophyll, not all of that light energy is going to be converted into chemical potential energy. This just shows the same thing, but what this shows as well is the gross and net primary productivity. So it's showing us here the fate of the solar energy reaching the leaf. So we've got all of this solar radiation coming in here at the top. Some is used for evaporation of water, so some might heat up water on the surface of the leaf and cause it to evaporate and cool the leaf as it does so. Some is reflected from the leaf surface. Some, as we said, is transmitted through the leaf. It doesn't hit a chloroplast or chlorophyll. So this shows then of the light that does hit the chlorophyll in the chloroplast and is of the right wavelength, then that's our gross primary production. So all of the solar energy that's been converted into chemical potential energy is our gross primary production. And you can see here respiration in mitochondria taking place, aerobic respiration, and some of that energy lost as heat, which leaves the net primary production, the amount which is available for the next trophic level for the consumers. Oh, this just says as well, some of that light hits non-photosynthetic parts of the plant, such as the bark. Okay, so we're looking here at the flow of energy through our ecosystem. So we've got the arrows representing the flow of energy. So you can see here, we've got, like we said, the producers here are the autotrophs, the organisms which can take those inorganic substances such as carbon dioxide and water and light energy and produce glucose. They can fix those inorganic substances into an organic molecule. And then we've got energy flow from the producer to the primary consumer, in this case a grasshopper, from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, and from the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumer. And obviously our consumers are all heterotrophs. They are not able to make their own organic molecules. They have to take them in a ready-made form. And you can see roughly about 10% of energy is transferred from one member of this food chain to the next. Each of these are called trophic levels. So we've got some key terms down here. A consumer eats or derives energy from other organisms. It's heterotrophic. And then we've got trophic levels. Trophic levels are the feeding levels, the stage or position or place or level in a food chain or food web. So our trophic levels are producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And we don't usually have very many more levels than this because of the inefficiency of energy transfer. There's a limit to about 4 or 5 trophic levels in food chains. So we've got energy losses at each stage due to a number of different factors. Okay, so we've got growth, movement, reproduction, which are all requiring energy in the form of ATP. So respiration has to occur in order for them to happen. We've got inedible parts and inaccessible parts. So, for example, you know, if, say, for example, an owl eats a blue jay, then there are parts which are either going to be, they're not going to eat inedible parts, like, for example, bones, like feathers. There might be parts of plants, say, for example, that are inaccessible to primary consumers. So, for example, primary consumers don't usually eat bark, for example, or roots, which are inaccessible. Roots are inaccessible. Other parts of the plant might be even be ingested, but be indigestible and therefore pass straight through the organism and don't actually provide the organism any energy. And of course, we've got respiratory losses as heat at each stage as well. Okay, this just shows the same thing. It's just reiterating the same point, really. It's just showing you that we've got here the light energy passing to producers by the process of photosynthesis, and then to primary consumers, to secondary consumers, to higher level consumers. These, don't forget, are our different trophic levels. But the thing here, it says is only a fraction of the available energy is transferred from one trophic level to another, about 10%. Energy is lost as heat during the respiratory process of each organism in the chain. And also parts of each organism are not eaten, so bark, roots, trunk, fur, bones, for example, or are indigestible, so cellulose, lignin in cell walls of plants is indigestible. And that limits the number of links in a food chain to 4 or 5 trophic levels. So food webs are just a more complex network of a food chain. So within most ecosystems, organisms feed upon a variety of resources and many food chains coexist. So it's not normally as straightforward as we saw on the previous slide. Linkages form between different chains, creating a complex network of connections. And what we can see in a food web, so here we can see an example of a food web. This is a marine food web, and again the arrows are showing the direction of energy flow from one organism to the next. We can see we've got a detritus food chain here, which starts with dead matter rather than with a producer. So that dead matter and decaying material is fed on by shrimps, which are fed on by anemones, and then sea slugs and seabirds. So dead matter obviously contains chemical potential energy as well. So we can get some food chains which start with detritus. We've also got here food chains with varying numbers of trophic levels. We can sometimes get organisms feeding at different trophic levels as well. It's not shown in this one, but for example, if you had a fox eating an apple, then the fox would be a primary consumer. But foxes are quite adaptable in terms of what they can eat. So as well as eating plant material, they would eat animals as well. So for example, a fox might eat a bird, in which case it's feeding at the 3rd trophic level as a secondary consumer. So you can have the same organism feeding at different trophic levels within these food webs.